Russia. A land of beauty and of harshness. A land whose people live on the edge of the knife. Some time ago, this land went through a change, turning from the waning monarchy into the world's first communist power. In this time of change, the powerful flame of revolution burned down the old Tsarist regime. Powered by the fuel of discontent and injustice, the Bolshevik revolutionaries rose up and through strife and sorrow created a new nation out of the ashes of the old. This is the story of the Russian Revolution. In order to fully understand the Russian Revolution, we must first look at the original. For you see, the events of 1918 were not the first instance of rebellion within the Russian state. The year is 1905. The recent industrialization of the Russian state has driven many thousands of Russian citizens into poverty and protest. On January 9th, hundreds of workers gathered outside of the Tsar's Winter Palace to protest terrible working and living conditions. The Tsar, however, was not there, and in his absence, as the protesters approached the palace, the soldiers began to fire into the crowd. It is unclear how many died. The official report from the Tsar's government says 92, but witnesses suggest that over 200 died in the shooting. This event became known as Bloody Sunday, and while the number of deaths remains ambiguous, one fact remains certain. This massacre was a spark that lit a fire. As news spread, so did civil unrest as many revolts, riots, and protests sprung up around the country. Unable to withstand the onslaught, the Tsar, Nicholas II, relented some of his authority, creating a system of assemblies known as the Duma. Unfortunately, the Duma held little actual authority in the Russian government, even being disbanded multiple times by the order of Tsar Nicholas II. The terrible conditions that sparked the original revolution remained largely unchanged. This, combined with the false promise of the Duma, created a massive discontent in the Russian state. This pressure built for 10 years, until it was eventually burst by one final event. World War I was a terrible event for the Russian Empire. They were left alone, fighting against the might of Austria-Hungary and Germany along the largest line of battle in the war, the Eastern Front. Russia was not prepared for this. Their infrastructure was underdeveloped, leading to slow travel and an inability to reinforce and resupply the front lines. They were not fully industrialized, leading to worse weapons and a lack of ammunition for troops. And their agriculture was inefficient, leading to massive food shortages for soldiers and citizens alike. The only way to keep up was with soldiers. More and more troops were sent to the front lines to die, and more were sent after to replace them. It is estimated that over 2 million Russian soldiers died in the Eastern Front, more than any other nation who took part. The inside of Russia also suffered from the conflict on its borders. The Tsar drained the resources for the war from his country, leaving it depleted. Refugees from the front flooded into the other parts of Russia. The quality of life and health fell, and while the rich feasted, the poor starved. One of the most well-known and hated figures of this time was the Tsarina Alexandra. While her husband was away, Alexandra took a monk known as Gregory Rasputin to be her advisor. With him by her side, the Tsarina began to fire elected officials, leaving the state corrupt and unpopular. Soon later, Rasputin was assassinated and the power of the Tsarina restricted, but the damage was already done. By 1917, the Russian state was at its limit. The combination of the war and the internal conditions had pushed the people past the breaking point. They were tired of the death and the endless war. They were tired of the poverty, starvation, and lack of representation. Finally, in early 1917, the anger felt by the Russian people boiled over. The February Revolution began on March 8, 1917. It is called the February Revolution because in the Julian calendar used until 1918, that day is February 23rd. That day, women of St. Petersburg began a protest asking for food. Soon they were joined by many others, and the riots and protests spread, growing in size and intensity. The slogans had changed from bread to down with the autocracy. In response, Tsar Nicholas II sent his troops to suppress the riots. Instead, many of the soldiers he sent switched sides, joining with the rioters. The fires of revolt were now unquenchable, and by March 15 their Tsar was forced to abdicate his throne, stepping down and giving up his power. This ruling authority was taken up by the Duma, the Democratic Assembly. The members of the Duma were for the most part of the upper middle class, factory owners and the like. Even though the Duma held power, they did not cement it. Under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky, the Duma did not pull Russia out of the war. They did not make significant changes to the system of feeding the country, and they remained unpopular. The Duma was corrupt and ineffective at changing what the people wanted changed. Soon enough, the people took action once again. The first signs of resistance to the power of the Duma came in July of 1917. Outraged by the continued war and lack of change, many Soviets worked together in an attempt to overthrow the Duma. The Soviet is groups of workers and other lower-class people who band together in independence. The Soviets were not alone. They were also backed up by a more radical organization known as the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were Marxists who shared the ideas of self-rule and equality with the Soviets. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, was a charismatic radical who fully believed in the ideas of Karl Marx. After a series of riots and other conflicts, the rebellions were suppressed, with Soviet leaders captured and Lenin forced into hiding. Yet this was not the end of the discontent. By October the Duma had still not pulled out of the war, but instead committed further, losing a massive defeat at the hands of the Central Powers. The fires of revolution still raged coldly, and the Bolshevik Party under Lenin began to plan. They set up contacts and agents, joined with disillusioned soldiers and other radicals, and prepared to strike. The Bolshevik Revolution, also known as the October Revolution for its date in the Julian calendar, began on November 7. The Bolsheviks and their allies seized the city of Petrograd overnight in a relatively bloodless uprising that took control over the Russian state, tearing down the Duma in the process. Lenin and the Soviet Committee had control, and they announced their intent to create a new socialist government of the people. A communist state. A conflict. The Russian Revolution changed the face of the world. It is responsible for the creation of modern communism. It made possible the formation of the Soviet Union. And it ended an empire that stood for generations. As the flame burned out, a new power was born from the ashes. A red flag flew over the USSR.